Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of the Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I am your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael S. Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. I also appreciate the formality with the middle initial. As a business and healthcare firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn some amazing stories. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the upside-down world of tech startups. In Silicon Valley, every tech startup dreams of someday being labeled a unicorn.
Now, Michael, since you love context so much, let's remind the audience, what is a unicorn? And a unicorn company typically is a startup that has a valuation of, let's call it over $1 billion on paper. Now, they actually don't have any financials to justify that $1 billion valuation, hence the term unicorn.
I'd rather talk about real unicorns and not unicorn companies. Did you know, Brad, that a unicorn horn is called an alicorn? Or did you know that a baby unicorn is called a sparkle? Or I guess even most importantly, did you know that in 1980, a U.S. patent was granted for a surgical procedure to create unicorns?
I did not know any of that. I feel like there could be some really good dad jokes there on having a unicorn company to make real-life unicorns. But let's go into our story. And today we have our guest that's joining us that hope he can tell us about a wannabe unicorn encounter.
Yes. Certified unicorn trainer and longtime attorney, friend, and law partner Jim Stanford joins us today. Jim was actually the first person I hired as a young lawyer back in 2004. And as a young partner at the time, it was many times the blind leading the blind as we were trying to take care of our clients. But it was an exciting time. And we actually did a ton of tech startup work back then, even more than the healthcare work. So Jim's background, he's from Colorado. He graduated from the University of Denver with a finance degree, then graduated from SMU Law School. In between there, he was in the Army, and he is an Army veteran. He learned how to speak Russian fluently during that time of his life. And we have all heard Russian Jim come out at different points in our career. He's now married to his wife, Laura, and his high school age daughter, Taylor. I guess, claim to fame in recent years is that Jim built his own saltwater fish tank, and we got the play-by-play as that thing was being constructed, and we were waiting to him have to run home as water spilled out all over his house, but that did not happen. And Jim, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it. A great way to spend a Friday.
Let's talk about the upside-down world of tech startup, filled with disruptive and innovative ideas and lots of excitement. Unfortunately, also full of charlatans with these grandiose plans and financials, as we kind of alluded to earlier, sometimes coming out of their proverbial arses. Now, this one in particular, is about a tech startup seeking to change the world of telemedicine with an innovative platform. We'll call it Telecorn to maintain the anonymity of those involved, but because of this company and the unicorn references, and then everything had to pop.
You know, as I have been preparing for today and thinking back to that time with Jim, we would travel half a dozen plus times a year to go to different meetings, and it really is difficult to describe the energy that surrounds most startups, and there's so much optimism. It was no different with Telecorn. I can remember board meetings where the conversation would inevitably turn to how the founders and investors were going to change the world with the billions they were going to make. And, you know, it's funny, they would make these just small assumptions like, you know, there's probably 10% of the market to gain by doing A, B, and C. And if we just gain 1%, we're all going to be worth $500 billion each. And you would believe it. I mean, you would get I mean, if I had money sitting there, I would have thrown it into the pile right then and there. And so it was a fun time. And it was at the beginning, there was so much energy, and it became harder and harder to maintain that energy over time.
Yeah, I remember those days. It was super exciting. I was, fresh out of law school. I was thrown into a river and had to swim. Very, very tumultuous river at that. But the idea of Telecorn started when a group of friends and successful entrepreneurs decided they wanted to start a new business. Only one or two of them had any experience in the tech industry, but that didn't stop them. They brainstormed and decided they were going to design and build a new telemedicine software platform, and spent hours upon hours brainstorming on names, trademarks, logos, all sorts of fun, neat features of the platform. And that's where a lot of the excitement really started.
Yeah, I actually remember those days. I was being brought in to help handle all the private offering work. I unfortunately did not get to attending these fun board meetings you'll often reference, but it was every single time we were doing a round we'd say, okay, we're going to do this round. And right when that round would end, they'd start the next round of raising capital. And there we go again, off to the races.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. It was a high-cost operation almost from the outset. They weren't intending on building the platform themselves. They were going to hire software coders to do it. But of course, they had the proverbial cool vibe loft startup offices, and so the atmosphere there was really, really cool. It's kind of like Silicon Valley cable show. But immediately they began hiring from the outset. With an initial round of seed capital, including funds from the founders, they got the show started. The CEO, who we'll call Ronald McTech, aka the Ron, was a former executive with IBM. So that's where we get, I think, the bulk of the tech experience. Being an executive with IBM, he had grown accustomed to virtually unlimited capital and resources during his prior life. And I feel this perhaps led to some efficient use of capital in the new startup.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us have a picture in our brain of what Silicon Valley is like with, the unlimited beer and candy in the kitchen, and the vibe was there. It wasn't quite like that back then. Back then, the Starbucks had just become a thing. And so I just think back to, you couldn't start a meeting, and for sure couldn't start a board meeting without there being a Starbucks run. And everyone would get their orders in, and they were hilarious. Everything was an off-menu order with the temperature of the coffee, the type of milk to be used. I actually think the Ron ordered coffee with unicorn milk heated to 140 degrees.
Yes, I do remember that. And of course, the Ron was a pretty charismatic and well-spoken guy. Through his contacts and his founders' relationships with various philanthropic organizations, they were able to raise sizable funds through multiple private offerings, bridge rounds, constantly boasting of ever-increasing projections and valuations, quickly getting into multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, while at the same time not even getting close to approaching any real revenues at all, much less a profit, of course. So new capital was being consumed at a tremendous rate. They engaged Indian company software coders, some of the employees of that Indian company temporarily relocated to the U.S. office, Telecorn's offices, and worked there on a full-time basis. They were constantly doing contract negotiations, new deals, new ventures and partnerships. Legal fees were skyrocketing because of this, the constant travel of back and forth, all the new deals. The incessant hiring and expansion was just eating away at every penny as soon as it came through the door. And of course, it didn't help, as well, having considerably high salaries of all the founders just added to it.
The classic mistakes of these startups, and particularly tech startups, we pick on them, I think, because of Silicon Valley, is the amount of spending that goes in at the beginning and the founders. And Telecorn was no different. They had this group of founders that all brought different successful experiences to the table, and they all had different ideas. And then there was, of course, the Ron, who was the appointed leader. But you can only have one captain of a ship. And as time wore on, the voices became more powerful, and there clearly was not a captain. And we see, one of the classic things happen where they pivot. And that's actually a term used in Silicon Valley that is probably a red flag, because the business plan shifts. And as we'll talk about, more, that impacts everything, because you're starting to spend your money differently that you've raised than you previously thought.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in from the private offering side and note that, constant change, or as you call it, pivot, is alarming when you're trying to help draft these documents. And we've seen in private offerings that they can't identify. If you can't identify your business plan, it is going to be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and how the story is building up, obviously, the next big pivot, which was growing, was that Telecorn's primary line of business became raising working capital.
Seriously, that was true.
Yeah, it literally, as soon as one round closed, due to this ridiculously high burn rate of capital, they almost had to immediately start planning for the next round of, whether it's a bridge round, convertible notes, direct equity with warrants, or whatever creative scheme they could come up with to attract more capital. It was essentially akin to, getting into the House and immediately trying to get reelected every 2 years to stay in office.
Yeah. I mean, their existence was chaos. It was like this cycle constantly of, are they going to run out of money, and what's going to happen? And then there would be this euphoria when they would raise additional capital. And oftentimes it was the existing investors trying to protect their investment. Every once in a while, some fresh blood, so to speak, would come in. And then it was so short-lived and became more and more short-lived before it was, we got to start raising more capital again so that we don't go under. And this went on for years. I mean, this was not the last couple of years thing. This is from the beginning through the end. In fact, through it all, Telecorn raised over $75 million from investors over this 5-year period. And I'm betting their revenues were well under $1 million in total over that 5-year period.
Whoa. So 75 million investments with less than $1 million in revenue. Okay. So this company sounds like it was more like the dodo who's going to go extinct versus the endangered species of the unicorns. But let's find out more about this company after the break.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back. We just learned about a wannabe-unicorn company and the upside-down world of tech startups. Jim, is this an unusual story?
This sort of thing goes on every day in private equity, especially in the tech world. While Telecorn's saga occurred well after the tech bubble of the late 1990s, in substance, it was substantially the same animal. Ridiculously overinflated valuations based on pipe dreams, where there was no real value or substance, and it ultimately led to the loss of a lot of money for the investors.
Yeah, it's not any different than the Silicon Valley strategy today. I think we talk about it being an upside down world because the strategy they employ from the very beginning is different than traditional business. I mean, we're used to, you got to have more cash that you make to be able to pay the bills and pay everybody, and your goal is to make a profit for the owners. And that's not the strategy in, the Silicon Valley startup and in tech in particular, but it really extends to other startups. The strategy is focused on building revenue. That is the metric. And so they really don't even think about profit. The goal is to grow revenue as fast as they can, and they're spending all that revenue into growing more revenue. And it's just a cycle to build the revenue up to a certain point so that with an exit plan to go public. And that's the big event that cashes out the investors. And so there's plenty of examples many have probably seen, like Uber, Airbnb, Twitter, even Facebook. They were all not making money at the time they went public, and some still don't. But that's the game on these tech startups.
Yeah, Twitter is a great example of that, as well as WeWork, where they had rounds of private investors coming in at up rounds that were actually higher than the IPO, and so these private investors were definitely losing money as soon as that company went public. And it's just a side effect of the private equity world and these startups of overinflated valuations and the investors losing out, and then the public market showing what the real perceived value is, even though they tend to still be overinflated with a lot of these high growth companies. And we've seen this too many times, the ugly fate for so many of these companies. At some point after an exciting start, they just can't make the jump into growing their revenues fast enough to keep up with the debts and to keep investors incentivized to want to keep their checkbooks open. There's quite a bit of risk involved in living the life of raising money, if that what your business turns into. And of course, when people start losing money and it disappears, they no longer want to invest, and they stop believing the boasting and the ridiculous projections. Brad, can you explain what companies like this can do to protect themselves from potentially angry investors down the road?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, being honest and transparent will almost always protect you. Of course, there's a lot more to that answer, and most of it revolves around security laws. And to be clear, both state and federal laws do apply when you're selling ownership in a company, even a privately held one. I know it's shocking to hear for a lot of people for the first time. But all these security offerings, basically, it has to either be registered with the SEC or you have to meet some type of exemption. And so let's go back to the story that we have right now. This company, if I remember correctly, was seeking investors in almost 30 different states. So we had a lot of different states that we had to comply with, or we had to find a federal exemption that would preempt all of this. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is protect them from future lawsuits. That's the whole purpose. And to obtain these protections, the company has to do something called, when it's making these securities, by using some type of honest and transparent private placement or a Reg D offering.
Jim, talk about what a private placement or Reg D offering is.
Well, like Brad was alluding to, essentially it's a private offering of securities of a private non-public company. Securities can be anything from stock, other sorts of equity, membership interests in a LLC. It could be convertible debt instruments or just promissory notes. Those are all securities under the Securities Act. You have to follow certain rules to be afforded this exemption from registration. And that's the great thing with a Reg D offering, is that you file a proper Form D filing with the SEC, and you're preempted from all the states' requirements, because every state has their own little requirements, and it would be just a tremendous burden to have to deal with all of them. So that's the benefit of doing a Reg D offering, as long as you meet the requirements for that. But overall, it involves preparation of documents that are drafted to provide as much transparency as possible, describe what's happening with the business, what its plans are, how the investors' funds are going to be used when the round closes. And this essentially allows an investor to make an informed decision and make an assessment of the risks. Now, of course, the company doing the offering really needs to make sure they do what they say they're going to do, and stick to the plan, or at least keep the investors informed to kind of mitigate risks that can go along with that.
Yeah, and in this world that we're talking about with private placements, it's a very common way for startups to find ways of raising funds. And the reason why they love it so much, it's a way they can develop and grow, but they're not under the pure scrutiny and glare of the SEC, and they can get all their money in place before they go to an IPO. But even with a private offering, as Jim was alluding to, there's a lot of rules that they have to abide for. Understand, this is not a public offering. The company is going to have some pre-existing relationship with these investors. As Jim was saying, they're going to provide certain assessments of material risk of investing in them. And generally for these offerings, especially the ones that we are part of, they're really generally only sold to accredited investors.
And the vocabulary word for today, everybody, is accredited investor. The general way to think about it is that this is, someone that has the sophistication in the eyes of the law that they can make these types of investments. The rules actually define what an accredited investor is, and it's based upon the net worth of the individual. And it makes a really big difference because if you are an accredited investor, then you're deemed to have, the ability to decide for yourself whether or not this is a smart investment.
Right. And because of that, that is one of the reasons why we make this recommendations for when we do private offerings for it only to be going to accredited investors, because in the eyes of the law, as Michael was defining it, is they are deemed to have this understanding of being more sophisticated in their ability to know what to look for and what to ask for. And therefore, the same material that you would have to disclose to a non-accredited, which is a significant amount more information, is not required. And then the last thing is everything that we're describing then is, the whipped cream with the cherry on top moment is when you then eventually file with, as Jim said earlier, you file what's often called the Reg D filing with the SEC. So then that will help solidify the process of those protections you need for the future.
Yeah, and we tend to see people at risk of getting in trouble or actually getting in trouble when they start puffing to make an investment opportunity look a lot more attractive than it really is, or to justify some grandiose valuation of the company. We constantly see every business wanting to look at an offering document as a prospectus to a customer, selling their product. And that's great, but that's exactly what you want to try to mitigate and disclaim those types of forward-looking statements and over marketing, puffing type comments, because that's what will get you hurt in the securities world. It's not entirely unlike a used car salesman boasting about a mildly air quote used Kia.
I actually saw the air quotes.
And this gets worse when you're dealing with companies that are increasingly facing insolvency and financial stress. They're desperate for more capital. Last thing they want to do is scare off investors by pointing out their dirty laundry that, if they don't get this, $5 million, they're going to literally go bankrupt and can't pay their employees. You tell an investor that, are they really going to run a write a check for $250,000? No, but you have to, because otherwise, you could be faced with securities fraud and all sorts of things. So we spend a lot of time guiding them on, the fine line between putting their best foot forward and not being misleading and being sure to disclose what they need to disclose. So then even with an accredited investor, they can't say that the wool is pulled over their eyes.
Yeah, Jim, you bring up a great point, and we often refer to as doing a private offering as really opening your underwear drawer. You need to show them all the good and the bad. And in this case, puffing up your financials or minimizing the risks associated with the investment, that can lead you to a lot of trouble. Normally, it's known as, when we see it afterwards, is you've fraudulently induced this investor to invest in it because they'd not received the correct information. And that is why, at least in this story, it was so difficult to develop these private offerings for Telecorn, because they kept changing their business plan, how they were going to use the funds, the long-term, the short-term strategies. And of course, this often has these huge consequences, which is also known as lawsuits.
Well, thankfully, as we talk about the story of Telecorn, they didn't make it, as you might have guessed, but they never got sued by their investors. And so, there is, I guess you would say, a silver lining because of the risk that extends, so deeply on the security side of things. Brad and Jim, I would love to hear y'all's final thoughts. And Jim, we'll start with you.
I'd say probably the biggest takeaway is to, if you're out there raising money for your startup, you need to start with a well-developed, colorful brochure with lots of pretty pictures and upward sloping charts. Just kidding. That's exactly what you don't want to do, unless it's combined with a well-drafted business plan that's properly caveated with the necessary disclaimers, and of course, well-developed set of risk assessments. The offering documents need to fully articulate the business, its anticipated plans, possible changes, as well as, like I mentioned, a full assessment of the risks. And this is definitely advisable, even if you're dealing with accredited investors. It just reduces the risks, for future challenges down the road when you have some unhappy investors.
Brad?
I'd say that one of the things we started off with is that unicorns are apparently near extinction, but I think a true unicorn tamer is nearly as hard to find. And so for those who are entering to this world of the private securities or private offerings, you have to understand something. Number one, you, the officers, the directors of the company, when you're making that private offering, you're responsible for the material in that offering. So as such, you could be liable to your investors. And not only just on that side, the state or federal government can come along with both criminal and civil security regulations if you violate those laws. So as you enter this area, be careful, be informative, give the investors the information they actually need, the unaware drawer moment, and do not push the limits. Provide all those same investors the same information that they need to make an informed decision.
We always talk thematically, to our clients and in these other podcasts, kind of about risk when you're dealing with legal implications of a business decision. How do you frame it in terms of risk? And when we're talking about compliance, the risk is different. It's elevated when there's orange jumpsuits in play. And so, raising money, as Brad mentioned, from private individuals creates a compliance risk. And my final thought is just to know that risk is compounded if you're raising money from private individuals for a healthcare transaction. So I would encourage everyone to make sure you have good counsel when you're doing these, both from a healthcare perspective, if you're in a healthcare transaction, and certainly from a securities perspective when you're raising money.
Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.